Thanks for that, Anja, and welcome to this session about the origins and the impact of the Humanitarian Initiative on nuclear weapons. My name is Sanja said, I'm Magnus. I'm very happy to be there. I've been looking forward to this session for quite a while. I used to work for ICAN. It's a while ago now, but it feels really good to be back. The topic of this session feels a bit personal to me. I was thrown into the Humanitarian Initiative before it was known as the Humanitarian Initiative some 13 years ago. I was fresh out of university with relatively few ideas of how the world really worked. And I've spent an perhaps unreasonable amount of time since then to think about what we were actually doing, what Humanitarian Initiative was, what it is, and perhaps more importantly, what it can become. And it's not yet clear in my mind exactly what the answer to those questions are. It's still a mystery to me, and it feels important somehow. But you here in the audience are coming to this session and to this conference with absolutely no idea about what the Humanitarian Nuclear Weapons Initiative is about. Do not worry, perhaps we can figure it out together. And we're really lucky to have with us on the stage here today 3 remarkable individuals that were all in different ways key architects behind the Humanitarian Initiative. We have Steffen Kongstad, the former ambassador of Norway, Patricia Lewis, director of the International Security Program at Chatham House, and Peter Herby, former head of the Arms Unit at the International Committee of the Red Cross, now with the Norwegian Red Cross. But more important than their current and former titles, Steffen, Patricia, and Peter are 3 unique personalities, unique thinkers. I myself learned a lot from them over the years and found a really great inspiration in their work. So with your help, I was planning in this session to try to take you a bit on a journey through time, a journey through what I consider some of the key moments in the Humanitarian Initiative on nuclear weapons. And if you, by the end of this session, have a clearer sense not only of what this initiative is and has been, but more importantly, what it, through your advocacy and your communication and campaigning efforts, what it can be, I will have achieved, I think, what I hope to achieve with this session. Without further ado, let's switch on the time machine and go back to Geneva 13 years ago on the 20th of April 2010. I think it's late morning. The president of the International Committee of the Red Cross at that time, he's just stepped up to the podium at the ICRC's headquarters in Geneva. And that president, Jakob Kellenberger is his name, has an important message to deliver. And he's invited representatives of all countries to listen. So this is a snippet of what he said, delivered in his own words.
Today, nations have a historic and unprecedented opportunity to bring the area of nuclear weapons to an end. In recent weeks and months, energetic diplomatic efforts have put nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation at the top of states' agendas. The ICRC calls on states to pursue concrete steps that will lead to a legally binding international agreement to prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons. The world cannot afford to wait. Nuclear weapons are unique in their destructive power. They cause unspeakable human suffering and pose a grave threat to future generations and the survival of humanity. Nearly 65 years ago, it was an ICRC delegate, Marcel Junot, who was the first foreign doctor to bring help to the victims of Hiroshima. He described scenes of unimaginable devastation and anguish. Modern-day nuclear weapons would no doubt cause immeasurably more damage than the atomic bombs that hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. I therefore appeal to all states to work together and seize this unique opportunity to ensure that nuclear weapons are prohibited and eliminated, once and for all.
So, Peter, if I may start with you, you were the head of the arms unit of the ICRC at the time when this speech was delivered, and you were therefore responsible for the ICRC's policy, messages on nuclear weapons. I want to start by asking you, what role did you play in the elaboration, the drafting of this speech, and what were you and the ICRC really trying to achieve?
Well, my role initially was to sit in my bedroom on my laptop and write this first draft of the speech. And of course, I had no idea would it survive the machine or not, the vetters at all the different levels, but it basically survived pretty much intact. But it didn't come from nowhere. We'd been preparing this for about a year by looking at the current context on nuclear weapons, the Obama speech, the Security Council summit, that things were changing and that we needed to speak out. And the strange thing is that the ICRC had a very strong position on nuclear weapons since September 1945 and many times after that, but including an update after the 1996 International Court of Justice opinion on nuclear weapons, where we updated our position. But unfortunately, it was in the archives, so it existed, but people weren't talking about it. So what we did over a year was basically say we have to up our game. We have to say what we believe publicly. Now, if ever, is the time to do it. And that's where that speech came from. And of course, the intent was to reframe the discourse in terms of what the ICRC and Japanese Red Cross had experienced in Hiroshima, which was horrific. The fact that we knew, because we had just finished a study, that we had no real assistance capacity to assist the victims of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. We also knew that, and that was said in the speech, that basically this is contrary to international humanitarian law. So all of that, basically what nuclear weapons do to people, we wanted to put on the table.
And what were you hoping that this, by putting this on the table, that it would lead to?
Well, we were hoping to change the discourse. You know, there'd been endless meetings and discussions about nuclear weapons in terms of security, geopolitics, military strategy. But in fact, it wasn't until the 2013 conference in Oslo that states had ever met to discuss what they do to people, what are the humanitarian impacts of these weapons. So the intent was to reframe the discourse in terms of the basic rules of international humanitarian law, about what they mean for people in the short term and the long term, genetic damage to the children of survivors, and so on. So, I mean, there's one little quote, if I may, just from the speech, which sort of encapsulated what we were trying to say and do, which is, that wasn't in that part, but the existence of nuclear weapons poses some of the most profound questions about the point at which the rights of states must yield to the interests of humanity, the capacity of our species to master the technologies that it produces, and the extent of human suffering that we are willing to inflict or permit in warfare. So that's like the existential question that was often being utterly ignored in decades of discourse on nuclear weapons. So the idea was to break out of that discourse and start a new discussion.
He seems, I love that speech and I love that video. It looks like it's from the 1970s or something with that little timestamp in the corner. He also looks, the president looks a little bit tense in delivering it. Was he nervous about what kind of reactions he would get? Did you get any reactions to this speech at all?
We didn't have any dramatic pushback, no. I think by then the governments had gotten used to the ICRC speaking out on weapons issues because of the work on landmines, cluster munitions, arms trade and so on. So they were a bit used to it. But I mean, I know that the nuclear weapon states were annoyed. Yeah, one time afterwards, the French ambassador told me, "Oh, it's great what you said, because showing how destructive nuclear weapons are just increases the value of our deterrent force." So, you know, that's a cynical take on this speech, but you know, they weren't happy, but I think there was no dramatic pushback. They just sort of thought, oh, gosh, ICRC is going off again. But of course, they didn't know what would follow, and then they got, as the Humanitarian Initiative developed steam, they got more and more stressed, and they started doing all kinds of things that were probably not even in their interest, because they were so worried about where this was going. But yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, we're going to get into that, the opposition that and the reactions that this initiative triggered among some of the nuclear-armed states in a little while. But I just wanted to say that that speech has been really incredibly important to me personally. I probably read it some 200 times. I encourage you all to also look it up if you have the chance. But of course, this humanitarian initiative, a major international political and humanitarian initiative, did not come about as a result of one speech alone. And Stefan, when this speech was delivered, you were the Director General of the Norwegian Foreign Ministry Department for Security Policy in the High North, I believe. And from your point of view, why and how did what would later become known as the Humanitarian Initiative start?
Well, there was at the time a growing dissatisfaction and frustration that there were no progress on nuclear disarmament, despite what had been agreed in the context of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And back in 1995, it was agreed to extend the Non-Proliferation Treaty indefinitely, provided that the nuclear weapon states started to honor their obligations under Article 6 of the treaty. And at the NPT review conference in 2000, 13 steps towards nuclear disarmament were adopted by consensus. In 2005, the review conference broke down and had no outcome at all. And by 2010, there were growing concerns that there were no progress whatsoever related to nuclear weapons, and that the most potent and dangerous weapons, while there had been significant achievements regarding other types of weapons. I must also say that in addition to the threats posed by the existence of nuclear weapons, some of us were also quite concerned how these weapons apparently seem to serve as an excuse for not having an adequate conventional national defense, which I think is what we are faced with today, in today's circumstances. But broadly speaking, there were two major challenges. There was a lack of public attention. There was ignorance, indifference, denial, and arrogance. And the nuclear issue had become extremely exclusive, only to be dealt with by the select few. And most people were not concerned. The other thing was, there was a lack of an independent, agile, and credible civil society partner. And most academic and civil society actors, NGOs, interested in the nuclear issue, had been, I would say, co-opted and part of the nuclear establishment. And there were nothing like the ICBL had been for the landmines or this CMC for cluster munitions. But back in 2009, 2010, several elements came together. President Obama held his famous Prague speech in 2009. It caused no practical action by the US, but it brought the nuclear issue back on the agenda and made it legitimate among, for instance, allies to talk about nuclear disarmament in a different way. Then we had President Kellenberger's speech in April 2010, just before the NPT review conference in May. And that was an important statement, which with the authority and legitimacy of the ICRC, made it clear that the nuclear weapons represented also a humanitarian issue. And that had significant impact. At the 2010 NPT River Conference, it was adopted 64 action points, and the famous sentence that underlined the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. And then, in August 2010, the IPPNW Global Conference took place in Basel. And that was when I, for one, realized that ICAN had the potential of becoming a new driving force and an important civil society partner for Norway. And that was the beginning of bringing new people, new organizations, new perspectives, and reframing the issue, and finally changing the discourse.
Thank you. I want to follow up and ask you what you and about your role and what you thought that this reframing in humanitarian terms of nuclear weapons will lead to. But I'll just save that for a little bit later, because I want also to bring Patricia into the discussion here. And of course, the fact that nuclear weapons cause unacceptable or unspeakable human suffering is nothing new, really. I mean, we just heard how Marcel Junot, the ICRC delegate, described the scenes of devastation and anguish in Hiroshima now nearly 80 years ago in 1945. And from your point of view, Patricia, what was it about the world in the early 2010s when this speech was delivered that made it possible to bring a humanitarian perspective on nuclear weapons back to the forefront of the international debate?
You know, I go back a lot further than that. 2010 was the result of what happened before, right? So I go back to the post-Cold War era, where there was this sort of, new flourishing of all sorts of arms control and disarmament treaties. And one of those was the Chemical Weapons Convention. Right? And we already had the Biological Weapons Convention, had the test ban, which was following on from the '63 test ban, had the Mine Ban Convention. I think that was the critical moment, really. And then everything that followed from that with attempts on small arms and light weapons, the Arms Trade Treaty, and of course, cluster munitions. And the framing of all of those was about the humanitarian impact of the weapons. And that was the basis for all of those treaties. And so those of us working on those weapons systems, as well as on nuclear weapons, are going, why are nukes not included in this, right? This is bonkers, sorry, that's the phrase I use a lot. The humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons is so clear because it is the basis of nuclear deterrence. It is everything about it. So there was no pretending about that. So if mines, if chemicals, if biologicals all are prohibited because of their devastating humanitarian impact, then nuclear weapons should be as well. It's just a no-brainer in that sense. And so we were in UNIDO working on all of these issues, and we developed what we called disarmament as humanitarian action, which we looked at it in the full picture and made those connections between them all. We tried to make connections with the science, with the psychology, with the philosophy. We just tried to make as many connections as we could, because we're in a very complex system. And I think this is the why of nuclear disarmament. And because it's also the why of nuclear deterrence, it makes for a really interesting conversation, one which I don't think we fully engaged in yet, and I think we're going to, and we can talk about that later. So something needed to change, and in the late 90s, we started this whole way of thinking. Others did too. And by 2010, it was becoming quite mainstream. But of course, then I think those that liked the terror of nuclear weapons that forms the bedrock of nuclear deterrence then began to realize that what was happening was going to undermine that. And that's when we entered into a period where it became more difficult. But we can talk about that as we go along, I think.
Indeed. Brilliant. Thanks very much. Let's now, we've been in 2010, let's go back into the time machine, and I'll enter the 5th of March 2013, Oslo Plaza, just some blocks from here, Norway, and switch it on. Nearly 3 years have passed since Kellenberger delivered his speech in Geneva, and in the meantime, the government of Norway has invited states, international organizations, civil society, and other interested stakeholders to an international conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. And the Norwegian foreign minister at the time, who I believe may come here to speak to you tomorrow, Espen Barth Eide, was only supposed to be at this conference during the opening, but as the conference unfolded, he became so excited about it that he decided to come back towards the end of the conference to deliver his own reflections on what had happened. So take a look at this.
Together, we have made this conference into a great success. I believe that we have succeeded in reframing the issue by introducing the humanitarian impact and the humanitarian concerns at the very center, at the core of the discourse on nuclear weapons. Taking that approach, it becomes very clear that this is everybody's concern, and it's equally legitimate for nuclear states and non-nuclear states alike to care about this issue. In doing so, we believe that we are taking the debate about nuclear weapons out of the somewhat traditionalized and institutionalized arenas that are already existing. We are not intending to substitute them. This is a supplement, but we do believe that there is a new sense of urgency that shall govern our work in this area.
Sorry about the lack of synchronization between voice and the sound and the image on that little clip. Time travel is very, very complicated. We have succeeded in reframing the issue of nuclear weapons, he said. And Stefan, you were not alone, but you played a critical part in the planning and the organization of this conference that we just heard about. What exactly was the purpose of the Oslo conference?
Well, there were several purposes. One was to break the stalemate, to create a situation where something could happen. It was to, through the humanitarian lens, bring the nuclear realities back on the nuclear agenda and into the meeting rooms. The humanitarian approach allows for bringing or demonstrating, picturing the realities. And to take an approach and frame the issue in a way that was unassailable and even politically irresistible. And also, I think it's important to say, was to give ICAN a space, an opportunity to establish themselves as the leading actor on the civil society side in a new campaign. And that is what they exactly managed to do. The challenge was at the time to keep the conference as a purely humanitarian conference and keep the traditional disarmament actors away. And we, for instance, experienced that the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, which I heard from earlier today, they insisted quite strongly to be included as participant. We didn't want that, so that was refused, and we made sure that some of the humanitarian UN organizations participated instead. So the humanitarian purpose made it possible to other NATO allies to participate. And the P4 boycott was probably a big strategic mistake on their part. And they missed an opportunity to make their case. But that was fine with us.
Indeed, yeah, exactly. I mean, not everybody were equally happy about this conference, and you mentioned it a few weeks before the conference were to take place. 4 or even 5 of the members of the UN Security Council, they turned up at the offices of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Oslo to tell Norway that they did not intend to participate. And of course, Norway was and continues to be tied to an alliance that consider nuclear weapons as part of its strategy. What, apart from the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs and managing those expectations there, what were the main sort of political or diplomatic challenges that you experienced in the organization of this conference?
Well, there were people out there, of course, who saw this, that it could potentially become a slippery slope. And we're not entirely wrong about that. But by insisting on looking, or I would even say bringing back the humanitarian perspective on nuclear weapons, that was very difficult to kind of attack, because it was legitimate to do that. It had to do with preparedness, emergency, things like that, which had been kind of showed away for quite some time. So at that moment, there were not really strong diplomatic pushbacks.
Okay, that's super interesting, and I think we will, as we move forward in time, we will come to points where there is indeed strong diplomatic pushbacks. We'll reflect upon that then. Patricia, you also participated. You were here in Oslo in 2013. You participated, you delivered a presentation, I believe, a sort of 101 introduction to nuclear weapons, what they are and how destructive they are. And compared to, you have wide experience in various international disarmament and non-proliferation arenas. Compared to these existing arenas, what was, from your vantage point, different about the conference on the humanitarian impact on nuclear weapons that were organized here in Oslo?
Well, I mean, one of the things about it was there was quite a buzz about it. Everyone wanted a ticket, and not everyone could come. So that was quite interesting. And then there was a will they, won't they about the UK coming, whether the UK would come. They didn't in the end, and in the end, the UK and the US came to the third Humanitarian Impacts Conference. Unfortunately, it didn't come to the fourth. So there was that kind of, something new was happening, something exciting. It brought in new civil society people. I think that was really critical. People who hadn't been part of the very tired old conversation, who weren't just saying, well, what you need to do is this, and then that will all be fine. And if you're not listening to me, then, right? So I think that's the critical thing. It brought in new energy and new focus. And there was a focus on science. That was really important. There was a focus on the weapons themselves. There's a lot of curiosity from people, because I think what had happened is that people had forgotten what nuclear weapons do. They thought only about the radiation, and they thought it would be a bit like Chernobyl. And then when they heard what the real impacts of nuclear weapons are, the blasts, the fires, the terrible prompt radiation, the extraordinary numbers of death in the first instant, and only then do you get that long-term radiation problem, I think that woke up a lot of people. So it was really that focus. And then, as it went on, the development of the conversation about the risks of nuclear weapons, which I think is such an important conversation, which is really behind, I think, everything that people are trying to do to eliminate nuclear weapons.
Brilliant, thanks. Both you, Patricia and Stefan, you have mentioned the importance of bringing in new actors, and particularly ICAN. And Peter, you were also in Oslo in March 2013. You were sort of helping organizing the Red Cross and Red Crescent movements' involvement and participation in the conference. And what did it mean from that perspective? How did this conference provide opportunities for your work?
Well, I think it was an extraordinary event. I mean, as I said earlier, it's the first time in the nuclear age that countries, governments stopped and looked at the impacts. And I think still now it's one of the things we need to do is to make people uncomfortable about this issue, to talk about it. Like in Norway, ask your government, what level of human death and suffering will happen when a nuclear weapon is used on Oslo or Bergen, and do this in other countries and ask them, okay, and with that many injured, how much facilities do you have to care for those people? How many burn beds? How much iodine have you stocked? What about food supplies when the area is contaminated? That's what they don't want to talk about, because the conclusion is that this has to be prevented. We have to stop this madness. So, but the fact that this conference was happening in Oslo was also extremely important in, first of all, that the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, which by then had adopted the ICRC position as a movement, due to Norwegian Red Cross and others who took this forward, it showed them that our concerns were being listened to, and that triggered, of course, more investment, because something was happening for the first time in the nuclear age to listen to these concerns. So that it was very important, and it also showed that, as had happened with other weapons issues, that it was possible to build this synergy between governments, civil society, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. And maybe I'd just like to mention one other factor that I think was extremely important, which was the act of bravery of one individual who worked in disarmament in the UN, Richard Lennane. He was in the biological weapons part of the Secretariat in Geneva. And he started writing this blog post called Wildfire. You look it up, just look up Wildfire Nuclear Disarmament. And basically, Richard, while still a UN disarmament employee, started writing about basically exposing the nonsense of how governments are talking about nuclear disarmament, the double talk and hypocrisy of the nuclear complicit states, the discourse of the nuclear weapon states, but even the discourse of the non-aligned states, who had always been in favor of nuclear disarmament, but they could never do anything because the nuclear weapon states weren't responding. And he basically, as they say, took the mickey out of everybody's arguments and showed what nonsense was being spouted in official UN arms control circles. And I think this made people really uncomfortable, because they'd see their speeches dissected on this blog post and with a great deal of humor. And I think this, we say civil society, governments, Red Cross, but I think also Wildfire was part of the game. I mean, the first line of the blog, when he launched it anonymously, says, "Changing the game on nuclear disarmament." And I think it had a huge impact, because people realized, oh, we can't keep spouting this stuff because we're being exposed. And he used to bring a big weasel. He labeled the complicit states the weasels, and he brought a massive weasel to these conferences. And it really, I mean, it was both humorous and devastating in terms of the discourse. So I think that was one of the things launched after the conference, and had a profound effect. Finally, he had to leave the UN and continued for the following years in his own name, but it wasn't sustainable to stay in the UN after launching that. But it was a major force.
Indeed, and I fully agree on that story about Wildfire and Richard Lennane and what he did. I think it was also very important for us in ICAN at that time, because we were sort of seen as quite radical, sort of out there, sort of calling for the impossible. And then he came, and he was even more radical, and that made us seem mainstream, right? Extremely important. Exactly. And he was, critical across the board, not just the nuclear armed states and their allies. He was also critical of the ICRC. And ICAN is writing these, very nasty blog posts about the ICRC. And funnily, now he's working with the ICRC, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, let's step back into the time machine again, and fast forward from 2013 to the 27th of March 2017, 6 years ago. A lot has happened in the 4 years since the Oslo conference. Mexico and Austria have organized 2 more conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. ICAN has developed into a very professional and hard-hitting global and increasingly well-known advocacy and communication campaign. More and more states have joined the bandwagon, which set off in Oslo, and the call that we heard Kellenberger make in 2010 for a treaty banning nuclear weapons on humanitarian ground is increasing in strength. And as a result of this, of course, a mandate of negotiations for a new treaty has been adopted at the UN, and negotiations are about to kick off in New York. And at the same time, while all this good stuff is happening, the opposition to the treaty has grown. And on the very same day and in the same building, in fact, that the negotiations are about to start, the US ambassador at the time, now I understand, a presidential candidate in the US, Nikki Haley, decides to organize a press briefing. This is what she said. Listen to this.
Morning. How is everyone? Happy Monday. We've got a lot of people piling in, so we're just going to let them get ready. Y'all come on in close. Love each other. Come on in closer, closer, closer. Okay, first of all, thank you very much for being here. We wanted to stand here basically just to have our voices heard. The first thing I want to say is, you know me as the U.S. ambassador to the UN. But first and foremost, I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm a daughter. And so I always think of my family first, as every one of the people behind me do as well. Then we go and we look at our positions. And what are we supposed to do in our jobs? Our jobs is to protect the people in our country, keep them safe, keep the peace, and do it in a way that brings no harm. Every one of the people behind me, that's our #1 goal. That's the goal of our countries. So now, suddenly the General Assembly wants to have a hearing to ban nuclear weapons. As a mom, as a daughter, there is nothing I want more for my family than a world with no nuclear weapons. But we have to be realistic. Is there anyone that believes that North Korea would agree to a ban on nuclear weapons? So what you would see is the General Assembly would go through, in good faith, trying to do something, but North Korea would be the one cheering, and all of us and the people we represent would be the ones at risk.
So we wanted to stand here basically just to have our voices heard. That is, in my view, an astounding statement coming from the world's arguably greatest military and political power. Stefan, when did you envisage that this reframing of nuclear weapons in humanitarian terms could or would lead to the negotiations of a new treaty banning nuclear weapons?
That's a difficult question to answer, but when you look back, everything might look quite straightforward, but it wasn't. There were many doubts, there were many discussions on what to do and not to do. And one could say that the 2013 conference in Oslo was the combination of a very long process of preparations. You earlier asked me about political opposition, political pushbacks, diplomatic pushbacks. At the time, as I said, it wasn't as much as I think we experienced with the landmines and the cluster munitions, especially landmines. And that's, I think, is an interesting thing, because it also points to reality that the nuclear weapon states, they think they can ignore others, and they have absolutely no intention of getting rid of their nuclear weapons, as it is. But, of course, the objective of the Oslo Conference and that process and the Humanitarian Initiative was that somewhere down the road, the obvious conclusion would be reached, namely that nuclear weapons are too dangerous, pretty useless, and a waste of resources.
Thanks for that. I want to follow up, but we'll have to get through this. I just want to ask you, Peter. We see here a clear statement of opposition, and you already mentioned earlier that you got a somewhat snarky reply from the French ambassador as a result of this speech that Kellenberger gave in 2010. And given this sort of, I think it's a bit of a challenge, and we're faced with this challenge quite often, given this persistent opposition from the nuclear armed states and their allies to the TPNW. How can we argue convincingly that the TPNW will lead to a world without nuclear weapons? And is that, should we do that? Should we try to do that?
Yeah, I think, is it on? I think I mean, first of all, we have to believe in the power of the norm that we've created, the taboo that Nina was talking about earlier. I think we also simply have to have a long-term perspective. But I think, for one thing, those who are threatening the use of nuclear weapons basically want us to fear their power and their ability to coerce. I think we also need to make them think about the implications of using nuclear weapons and put fear in their mind, in the sense of they're realizing that they will forever be stigmatized as the one who has broken the nuclear taboo, who has ignored the express message from the TPNW, the 125 states that adopted it, which clearly demonstrates the strength of this norm globally, that they will basically be, stigmatized if ever they dared to use this. You remember the Russian general whose name Patricia has in her head probably, who basically didn't launch Russian nuclear weapons, Soviet nuclear weapons.
Stanislav
Petrov.
Yeah.
Despite having radar indications there was an attack coming, because there was something inside of him, first of all, that said this can't be happening because of the political context, but also apparently he wasn't willing to do it. Those things matter. I mean, that might have saved the world. So this internalization of what it would mean if you ever used nuclear weapons, I think is very important. I think it's also important to have a long-term perspective. You know, the successes that have mattered historically are things that have taken decades or hundreds of years in some cases to achieve. The abolition of slavery, the effort to end child labor, the stigmatization of smoking. These things take decades, and I think in our world we tend to focus on what we can achieve between now and next year, the short term. There's an anti-war activist priest called Daniel Berrigan that used to speak to young activists during the Vietnam War, and he said, you have to realize that in the world people used to do things, building the cathedral in Chartres and other of the great cathedrals of Europe. People would start doing this and they knew they would not live to see the thing finished. They knew that it was going to take 120 years to achieve that, but they risked their lives every day climbing up the scaffolding, and they built the thing. And I think that we also need to have this kind of a long-term perspective and confidence that the thing we're building is having an impact now, partly in preventing the use of nuclear weapons. And I think we also need to focus on intense political pressure in many of the nuclear complicit states, because at some point the political circumstances are going to be right, and one of these states is going to renounce the nuclear weapons so-called umbrella, which umbrellas usually keep the rains off, but this umbrella doesn't actually prevent nuclear war. So at some point things are going to break, and we're going to have yet a new situation But in the current situation, I think the strength of the norm and the stigmatization of any thought of use is very relevant.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Peter. And we saw what Nikki Haley said in 2017, and I think we have said statements about that are even more hostile to the TPNW coming from some of the nuclear armed states. But at the same time, some NATO states, some of the nuclear complicit and nuclear allied states, they appear in recent years to be a bit maybe more open or a bit more friendly to at least the humanitarian underpinnings of the TPNW. So Germany, Norway, some other NATO members participating in the first meeting of states parties to the TPNW that took place in June last year. Patricia, are there signs that the nuclear armed and the nuclear allied states are becoming less hostile to the TPNW? And if yes, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you for the Nikki Haley clip, which I thought, I mean, I just love that bit where she's acting as an NGO barred from the room. She was welcome to go in, as you know. I think that the problems that a number of countries have got, whether they possess nuclear weapons or in alliance with those that do, is there's been a very strong belief system for a long time that nuclear weapons prevent war, right? And it's very hard if you believe that to argue then against nuclear weapons. So it's, many of the churches have said for a long time, it's the lesser of two evils. However, that is being shaken, right? That has been shaken. And it's been shaken for a number of things, I think. One is obviously recently with this terrible war that Russia's waging against Ukraine. But I think it's been shaken partly because of the humanitarian impact conferences and the evidence that came out there from the risks. The work that's been done over history in terms of the close calls and the near misses. And then some of the sloppiness around nuclear weapons these days with, you know, the people in charge of them doing drugs, being drunk, doing all sorts of unsavory things and behaving quite badly. So I think that this has been shaken that belief. And I think that there's a worry within some of the NATO countries, which won't be articulated in public, but that NATO as a military alliance is one thing, NATO as a nuclear alliance is another thing. And you know, the military alliance, and we're seeing this now in response, I think as Nina rightly said, with the taboo against nuclear weapons. I was very taken with Ben Wallace, the UK Defence Secretary at Munich, talking about the nuclear weapons taboo and how they mustn't be used. And everyone knows that, of course, that is, in the end, the basis of deterrence. And I think the threat, the overt threat, is very different to the idea of somewhere in the background there's this nuclear weapon that might or might not be used in response. Right? That's a very different thing. So there's this kind of meeting of reality right now that is really unsettling people. So there's quite a lot of worry about use. And there was one thing to have them in the background, another thing to have them right here, facing you. And that's come quite quickly for a lot of people. I mean, for those who've been working on nuclear disarmament, we've been aware that this was very likely to happen. I wanted to just say that I'm not sure, though, that I think this is a moment where we really need to have very, very difficult conversations. And I'm not sure that we're really doing that. I think we're still talking past each other. And we need to talk about use and the prevention of use. That seems to me at the heart of the humanitarian issue. And one of the things that I really want to promote, and I know that people might think this is quite wishy-washy, but I think observer status is really important. We've seen observer status work very well in a number of other treaties. Landmines is one. The Cybercrime Convention, the Budapest Convention is another. Even within the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we've had observers like Pakistan, Israel, and so on. And I think we should encourage that sort of participation. so that even if countries don't agree with the treaty or can't sign it, but would like to maybe one day in the future, they would then engage with it and learn about it and maybe argue about it in the place where it's being discussed. So I really think that that's where we could encourage those countries that are very worried about nuclear use to talk about this and to talk about the risks of nuclear weapons in that way.
Okay, thank you so much. And I want to ask you more about those difficult conversations that you mentioned that you think we should have. But let's just go back one last time into the time machine and transport ourselves very close to where we are, the 1st of August 2022. And of course, since Nikki Haley's press conference in 2017, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has been adopted, is entered into force. ICAN has received a Nobel Peace Prize a few blocks from here. And the first meeting of states parties, as we talked about, was organized in Vienna. We also see, of course, the number of states signing and ratifying the treaty growing every month. But at the same time, as has been mentioned by several of you, Russia has invaded Ukraine, brings the threat of nuclear weapons back into the center of the international debate, which we just heard Nina talk about, and a nuclear war no longer appears a theoretical possibility. And the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, is quite worried, with good reason, one could add. Listen to this.
Humanity is in danger of forgetting the lessons forged in the terrifying fires of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Geopolitical tensions are reaching new highs. Competition is trumping cooperation and collaboration. Distrust has replaced dialogue, and disunity has replaced disarmament. States are seeking false security in stockpiling and spending hundreds of billions of dollars on doomsday weapons that have no place on our planet. Almost 13,000 nuclear weapons are now being held in arsenals around the world. All these at a time when the risks of proliferation are growing and guardrails to prevent escalation are weakening. And when crises with nuclear undertones are festering. From the Middle East and the Korean Peninsula, to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and to many other factors around the world. Excellencies, the clouds that parted following the end of the Cold War are gathering once more. We have been extraordinarily lucky so far, but luck is not a strategy, nor is it a shield from geopolitical tensions boiling over into nuclear conflict. Today, humanity is just one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation.
So the clouds that parted following the end of the Cold War are gathering once more. Patricia, following up on your previous comment, are we moving back into a world in which the possession and threat of use of nuclear weapons is becoming a defining feature of international politics? And if so, how can we turn this around?
And we're in danger of that. Yeah, there's no doubt. I'd just like to take a moment just to recognize what the people of Ukraine are going through right now. And then overnight, these terrible attacks, including on Zaporizhzhia again. We can see how if we carry on like this, that the use of nuclear weapons will become more and more likely, is that the right phrase, but possible. And the nuclear taboo is certainly being eroded in this war. But as Nina said as well, there have been threats from other places over the last few years. It's not the first time. So we have to turn this around for the people of Ukraine, the people of Europe, but also for everyone, because one of the things that has come out from the science is that if we had even a regional, small nuclear war, then it could set off a whole chain of events around the world to the climate, blocking out sunlight and creating famine, up to 10 years of famine. That's the calculations even for quite a limited use of nuclear weapons. So that's a very big worry. So this affects everybody. I think that we have to really get to grips with nuclear weapons deterrence and understand what deters, what doesn't deter, what the evidence is, and build in that whole taboo of use into that. So I'm really pleased that we've started to talk about risk throughout the wider nuclear non-proliferation world, regime, those discussions. Because I think that's really at the heart of where we need to be thinking about and where that takes us. I think everybody who works on nuclear disarmament has come through that route, right? We can marshal all the arguments about what's been promised, the legal aspects, da-di-da-di-da, but at the heart of it, it's understanding those dangers and the risks and understanding that the equation is not static and it's shifted and changed, and this is not the Cold War, and we don't have that same structure for thinking about it. When you mentioned Stanislav Petrov, where's Stanislav Petrov today? Do we have someone like that in North Korea or in Russia today? Do we? If we've got somebody who'd stand up and say, no, not going to use them. And you know, Guterres said, relying on luck is not a strategy, but we are always relying on luck. And it's too dangerous.
I'm also struck by this contradictory development over the past 13 years that we looked at here. On the one hand, we have the Norwegian foreign minister proclaiming that we have succeeded in reframing the issue of nuclear weapons, and we have negotiations on the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, yet this is what's happening in the world. What is the relevance of the humanitarian initiative in such a world that we're living in at the moment?
Well, I think it's even more relevant, right? Because everything that we've been worrying about is unfurling before our eyes. So in a way, it's a horrible thing to say, I told you so, because it's not helpful. But that is the case. So everything that we've been working on, that we've been trying to address through the humanitarian impacts meetings, through the discussions about the disarmament as humanitarian action, etc., is now, our worst fears are potentially being realized. And that fills me with great sorrow. I feel that we've been too slow. And I feel worried that we're going to miss this opportunity too. And I don't, you know, there's that saying about, you know, a lie is halfway around the world before truth is tying up her shoelaces. And it's, why are we so slow to engage on this? And is it because we're too few? Is it because we don't have enough cash? Is it because we don't have enough? Why is it that we're always having to fight the established status quo? Why aren't we grabbing the message? And I don't know the answer to that. And I think that trying to get this really into the understanding of people is our biggest task.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And I think that's also a question that is also for the audience here and the rest of this conference, that we will hopefully get some answers to that, how this opportunity can be seized. I think also...
One of the things I wanted to say was, I think that if I look back to the 80s, one of the things that we've lost a little bit is, in the nuclear weapon states anyway, is the work at the local level and the national level. There's some fantastic work at the international level, but at the national level I see less. And I'm just wondering how to fix that. And also, you know, making common cause with all sorts of different aspects of society, including the military. That was really important in landmines, for example. So how do we get those conversations going? Are we in our own bubble is the question I'm essentially asking ourselves.
Brilliant, thank you. Peter, I also wanted to ask, follow up on something that you said, and I think that in these times of geopolitical turmoil, it's quite easy as an advocate or an activist to feel quite quite powerful. It just seems so big and so out of control in a sense. And I think just in Norway here, that I'm familiar with, ICAN Norway has been working on gathering, making sure that there's awareness of this issue. The vast majority of the Norwegian population would like Norway to sign the TPNW. There's been a majority in the Norwegian parliament, thanks to ICAN's efforts, that will support Norway signing the TPNW. Even the current governing party, has spoken in favor of signing the TPNW, yet when decisions start to be made, nothing happens, and it sort of reverses course. And I think it's easy to feel a little bit hopeless in what can you do democratically to change positions and in such a context. And what, Peter, what would be your advice? What can ICAN campaigners and others do to get the nuclear armed states, but also the nuclear allied states, to reverse course?
Well, I'd say there's not a magic formula, but some of the things that I can think about. First of all, I think we've changed the discourse of the international disarmament, arms control community a little bit. Not all of them even, but we've changed that. But I don't see many places where we've changed the discourse at national level, where the parliaments have really taken this on as a main focus of debate when they discuss security policy among nuclear or nuclear complicit states. I think we haven't penetrated those circles. We're in the stratosphere still somewhere of the people who talk about nuclear weapons. We've changed that discourse, but only partially. So I think there's a hell of a lot more that has to be done at national level, strategically putting forward the humanitarian impacts, asking these hard questions I was referring to before about preparedness, and how can that country allow its citizens to be at risk as they are through irresponsible nuclear policies. The other thing that I think we have to recognize is that, the situation we're in, it's easy to focus on Russia and Putin and Ukraine and what's happening, but the situation we're in is because of a collective failure of arms control disarmament policy for several decades, where people were able to just keep pretending that they cared about disarmament without actually making progress, and while in many cases going the other way. That's how we have all the nuclear powers right now modernizing their nuclear arsenals. So the fact that so many countries that claim to be in favor of nuclear disarmament, or even step-by-step approaches, haven't been taking those steps and haven't been insisting upon them. They haven't succeeded. Things are going the other way. You have to say, you guys have failed, and you have to take responsibility for this failure, and that's part of the situation we're in now. I mean, with all the nuclear complicit states basically going on talking about how they want disarmament, but how important nuclear weapons are on the other hand for their security, and like Nikki Haley, we have to protect our people. I mean, what nonsense. You have to say, stop. So I think the discourse needs to change at the national level, and there are a number of ways of doing that. Which involve communication. And the last thing maybe is just to say, I think we have to keep what nuclear weapons do to people in the front and center constantly, because if it just turns into a debate between, join the TPNW or not join the TPNW, as important as it is as a norm, it becomes a ping pong, and we have to say, join the TPNW, or at least start down the road, because this is what is going to happen to our people if you don't. So I think there's plenty of work to do, and I think it's also having a long-term perspective.
Thank you so much, Peter. We're running out of time, actually. I just want to have one last question for Stefan that I also want to go through. I hope that's okay, just 5 minutes. There is this assumption that a humanitarian approach to nuclear weapons somehow stands in contrast to a security policy approach to these weapons, and I think we see this reflected in how work on nuclear weapons is organized within states, for instance. What can we do, Stefan, to challenge these assumptions? Can we do more to show that approaching nuclear weapons from a humanitarian perspective is not about ignoring security, but rather that it is about working towards and promoting a vision of security that is more logical, more sustainable, and more humane? Is there something we can do in that area?
Well, firstly, I do not see the humanitarian approach and the security policy approach as conflicting approaches. The humanitarian approach can present the reality of a nuclear weapons detonation, and that reality is also a security reality. And the security policy actor should consider what can provide real security. And much of the security policy thinking related to nuclear weapons is very much a legacy of the Cold War. And today the situation is very different from what we had during the Cold War. And we have seen that nuclear weapons do not prevent interstate war in Europe. And one could say that deterrence has lost much of its credibility. And the current events have also reminded us that politically and militarily the use of nuclear weapons is meaningless. And that we have seriously neglected our conventional defense capability. But I think we need to have that security policy discussion. A discussion that is premised and informed by what we have learned from the Humanitarian Initiative. And one thing we have experienced is that both anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions, they were considered as absolutely necessary means of war. Today, they are seen as having no utility, broadly speaking. Well, let's get there.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for that. That's also something to work on, I think, as this conference here today and tomorrow unfolds. It remains for me to wrap up this session. Just want to give a huge thanks to our brilliant speakers, Peter, Patricia, and Stefan, for making us all a bit wiser. So a round of applause. Thank you. And then just finally, I just want to highlight that none of the moments that we discussed in these sessions were inevitable. The development of the Humanitarian Initiative was the result of people discovering an opportunity and a shared purpose and their determination to do something about it. I think the early speeches, the Oslo conference, the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, it only sort of appears inevitable because it is in the past, but the past could, of course, have been different. And I think the same goes for where we are now and where we are heading. Nothing really is inevitable, and everything is up for grabs. Many of you have been told, probably, that bringing the nuclear-armed and the nuclear-allied states on board with the TPNW is impossible, that its failure is in some sense inevitable. From my perspective, this is an absurd statement. I don't know how many times I heard when I worked for ICAN in the early days that a treaty banning nuclear weapons was impossible, yet it happened. It was not inevitable, but committed people, determined people like you all made it happen. And I think to unlock the humanitarian political potential of the TPNW, we really need more of this commitment, more of this determination. And looking out at the audience here, and I think in light of the discussion we just had and also this morning, I feel really hopeful about the future. So with those parting words, I'd like to thank you again, then hand it back to you, Anja and Vanessa. Thank you so much.